Welcome to part three in our series on industrial AI systems in the era of AI with good friend and serial entrepreneur, advisor to many, many startups and larger organizations, Rick Bullotta. But we've already promoted his background and history in kind of parts one and two. And part one, if you recall, we kind of looked at the historical evolution, if you like, of industrial data. I guess I hate to call it ops or label it right now because we're talking about the future, right? But we looked at all the traditional data challenges faced in the industrial domain,
You can say that.
and
It's okay.
yeah, and Rick's journey from Lighthammer to ThingWorks, and started touching on how to establish the foundations for really the new era of AI ready data foundations, if you will. And then on the part two, we really got more into this idea of an industrial grade data fabric. And by the way, Rick, I have kind of two reports coming out. One I think is out, which is kind of more of a market landscape, trying to size what that future market looks like.
Mhm.
And because I was fairly liberal in kind of looking at not just the shop floor but end to end, right? Then I kind of came up with a number around about 20 billion, right?
Okay.
And But the interesting thing was the high growth areas were kind of industrial data ops, right, where you were getting into some cases nearly triple digits, and the data science side of it, which is kind of where you see the data bricks and Palantirs and a few of those others, right, kind of printing money right now.
Yep.
But I kind of got that one out, and then I've got another one which is really looking at kind of seven different archetypes or pattern that I see in terms of, no one does it all. So what are the pieces you kind of have to assemble? And maybe that's once you've had a chance and you've had some input on it, but once you've had a chance to see it, maybe we'll do that as a part four, right? Follow up. But what I wanted to do now is actually get a lot more practical, right? In terms of, right, we talked about a lot of the history and the foundations and maybe where it's going, but you advise and have high visibility of a lot of the roadmaps of the startups. And they're not all startups, but let's characterize them that way for now. Small companies that are really innovating in the space. And so I think in this part three, I'd really want to talk about referencing some of the needs that we talked about in the first couple of episodes, kind of what they're doing in many ways differently, and why you need that innovation. Those, I think in the AI wars, I think I called them the guerrilla innovators, right? It's kind of like you need those people that really are not just, and you still need infrastructure, so I shouldn't use just, but you know what I mean. It's they're not delivering the last mile, the real solution that deliver the outcomes that industrial organizations typically need. So maybe with that opening, kind of, we haven't prepped a script per se here, so why don't you kind of run with that? And I've got lots of angles on it, so I'll chime in once you've got going.
An interesting one. I was out actually in Bozeman 2 weeks ago, meeting with Twin Thread, and one of the presentations it was a board meeting and team meeting. One of the presentations was from a woman who's deeply embedded in the M&A investment space in this world, and she did a fantastic presentation. It kind of segmented AI startups and companies, and
Mm-hmm.
remember some of these startups are big public companies. We don't. I don't think we have a definition now of when startup ends. It seems to be longer than ever. But in any case, um, horizontal or general AI versus industrial AI, and then she segmented into kind of the value clusters. And the value one end, which we don't yet really have in industrial AI, is kind of like I would call it core infrastructure, like the open AI. I don't consider like the historians and people, really the high value infrastructural pieces, NVIDIA, all the
Right.
Someday we may have foundational models unique to our world, and some companies are building their own for sure. The second group, let's go to the other group. The low value group was those kinds of companies that are just slapping a chat front end on legacy stuff, right? So that's, and then valuation was proportional to that. The middle group, I think, is most apropos to our discussion, is exactly as you described. The people that are taking domain engineering, domain knowledge, still may have a platform element to it, but delivering vertical solutions for industrial customers. And they had pretty decent valuations as well. But that delineation, I think, was super interesting.
Right.
That's kind of where a lot of the emphasis is right now, actually solving some type of specific problem. And it's not all, as we discussed, in previous calls, it's not all just LLMs, obviously, and generative AI.
Right, and computer vision, and in some cases it's traditional AI ML techniques, but just packaged in the right way. So I think we already talked about Gen UI and the fact that yes,
Yep.
Gen AI has a very significant impact, and it's attracted a lot of money, which hopefully is now going to filter off into a lot of these other techniques. Interesting way of, and I think we should have a follow-up discussion on that after you kind of see my 7 archetypes, because in some ways I kind of characterized some of that as well, where I kind of had the data science centric players, and then I had the kind of IT enterprise infrastructure, but a bit more than infrastructure. It's not purely the cloud hyperscalers. Although you triggered another thought there when you were talking about the AI infrastructure, because it's kind of interesting to see what AWS versus Google versus Microsoft, kind of their different approaches. With AWS, I would probably try to be more of that AI infrastructure where you plug and play all the right models, whereas I'd argue the other two have got very strong allegiances to their own AI tool set or to OpenAI. So yeah, there's lots of ways to segment this, but I think let's zero into that high value, not the big mega players who I think we'll see evolve and do, and they've got money flowing at them, right? So it's kind of like they'll do some things in terms of that AI infrastructure, but the domain,
Yep.
that domain category, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see is really we already had a shortage of skills in the industrial domain, understanding. I was going to say the nuts and bolts, but it could be the chemical industry, right? But you get what I mean, all the complexities of making stuff.
Yeah.
And then you've got data scientists who are really good at data, but they don't necessarily understand the domain. So for a while I talked about industrial grade data scientists, and I still think there's an argument that you've got to have at least some that can cross those two domains, but they're going to be in very short supply for the foreseeable future. So, which is an opportunity, I guess, for your domain startups, right?
What is software at its core, right?
Yep.
Software is intellectual property and knowledge encapsulated in, algorithms and bits, right? So this is
Right.
And that's I think is dramatically different than 5 years ago. I mean, this is the other thing. We know that a lot of these technologies, neural net stuff. I remember, I don't know if we mentioned in a previous call, there were companies doing that in the 90s, some amazing stuff, right?
Right.
But the difference is, I think it is now more consumable and scalable, right? By scalable,
Right.
I don't mean cloud scale. I mean like you can deploy it faster. You can clone that quality optimization module and deploy it at your other 10 sites a whole lot more quickly. Even just generically, if the macro topic you started with, industrial systems engineering in the area of AI, pretty much even all the legacy vendors in our space can benefit from generative AI, right? Just to
Yep.
ease configuration. Think of like doing a SCADA system or configuring, banging out repetitive PLC code or whatever. Those tasks, they're just a logical use case for making it easier. Plus the factor you talked about, right? The people retiring, how do we encapsulate just even basic PLC programming so that new people can be more productive more quickly, that kind of stuff. So everybody's sprinkling that on. The, the chat around unstructured and semi-structured data, everybody's bolting that on, right? I mean, that's just kind of generic. The interesting stuff to me is as you said, the applied stuff, right? And moving beyond, like you asked for some examples. So one of the companies I work with is using, instead of doing image analysis, like if you think of most vision systems, they're primarily taking a snapshot and inferencing something, quality, presence of a label, whatever, all kinds of thermal analysis or whatever. What they're doing is actually looking at movement, and that's actually a really interesting thing. It's almost like the integral or derivative versus the snapshot. You can identify tasks and movements and things like that. So think of it like almost industrial engineer in a box that can look at, and when you can do that, you can start to train, you can start to use it for safety, you can start to use it for even automation of task completion. Why should someone have, if I move this piece from one point to the other, why should I have to run over to a keyboard? And then, so that's a MIT spin out called Leela that's doing that.
Is that Leela.ai, I think they're called, is it?
Super,
Yeah.
yeah, super sharp team doing some really awesome stuff. I think, I work like high byte's kind of critical on the data enablement side, right? So
Yeah.
whether it's in-house data scientists or any of the, myriad companies that are focusing on the AI solutions, we all know a lot of the clock time is still data prep. Data prep, interestingly, is another area I'm starting to see a lot of use in generative AI or and other tools like that to cleanse, shape, characterize the data.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was Aperio, I think, was one of the vendors I talked to who were purely focused on data quality, right? It wasn't
Exactly.
very, very strong solution just for that, and not just for industrial data, but it was kind of like that's kind of like a foundational piece that every other platform needs, right?
Well, I had an example the other day where, sparse data, right? Temperatures and pressures, they're always changing, right? The limits, the set targets, these are how do you historians have always done a great job of kind of putting, or an okay job of putting data in a way that you could square it up into nice clean tables that data scientists can crunch on. So a lot of that, again, whether it's feeding the needs of a data scientist to have contextualized, properly shaped data, whether it's to feed apps, that's kind of where the industrial data ops folks, the high byte, litmus, people like that. Other kind of applied stuff that I get involved with, Twin Thread's kind of full stack in that. So they've got some data ops stuff, connectivity, a kind of a twin model where you can contextualize the data from all the different sources. But where I think customers are, to your question about solutions, that's kind of where their strength is. And there's other companies, doing things like this, where there's an app or module for energy optimization, for closed loop quality optimization, for perfect batch execution, right? So going from the eureka moment kind of stuff, where we're going to look at a bunch of data, crunch it, and then, oh, wow, we should change our operating policies, to actually putting that into kind of closed loop, right? Where you're going to start with human in the loop and then kind of write it down to the PLCs. And then next level is kind of a very new company called Composable. It was a bunch of people at Onsci, which you remember from our Microsoft days. And they're trying to do the autonomous agent stuff, reinforcement learning, trying to do it in a way that you can kind of learn the process behaviors as opposed to too much guru factor needed. So they're, again, in that kind of agentic closed loop autonomy. And then I work with some folks that are like the really near term trying to support the frontline operator with knowledge, like OpsMates, one of the companies is doing that. Structured and unstructured data, real-time decision support. So there's all these different bits and pieces. Like when we talk about AI, it can't just be the chatbot, right? It's so much more in our world. And there are, beyond those, obviously, there's hundreds of other companies doing awesome stuff, from You can asset focused kind of AI where they've accumulated
Right.
huge knowledge about how, this pumps behave, or the untapped or less tapped we talked about. The last one was, and I think is the high value, is the process, looking at the processes themselves. So that area I think is actually going to be where a lot of the value gets captured.
Yeah, I kind of, I think in my data fabric, I had put something called process intelligence because I kind of wanted to capture that thought as well, right? Whereas, and it's not just the manufacturing process, it can be business process. And in fact, I would say that's more mature in the sense it's highly standardized, so they can just look at the standardized process, but then look at the time cycles and variations and kind of make very specific recommendations when you're talking about an ERP or CRM process. It's quite different. We don't have that luxury, right? When it comes to the shop floor, we kind of have to learn about the process and its very specific
Line
attributes, right?
being specific. Was it Salonis? I think was one of the early.
Yeah, I remember them. Yeah, yeah,
I remember
yeah.
coming across them like that's really smart. Focus on process intelligence.
Yeah, and in some ways, you're kind of touching on a couple of notes I jotted down ahead of the podcast. I really wanted you to talk about the growth use cases you're seeing and how they're being showcased by startups. But you've also touched on the fact that a lot of the technologies are enabled by this things like Gen AI that make it much more scalable, right? So, and maybe towards the end, we can maybe talk about how do these startups, go beyond startups to grown-ups, right? What's that future look like for them? And I think there's plenty of room there. As I said, I just looked, I did, and I thought I was very conservative when I just looked at the industrial data fabric market because I was kind of constantly reducing the contributions of the larger players to get it to a reasonable number, right? But I think there is massive opportunity just on the data side, let alone all of the outcome-based solutions that will sit on top of that, right? But I also made a note that let's talk about and who have we mentioned so far? Kind of high byte, twin thread, Leela, composable, which is kind of more on the autonomous side. And interestingly, you mentioned asset based, right? So in my
Be like the auguries and people
yeah,
in that area.
that's a good one to I think call out as well. But it was like as I did that categorization more from a data fabric perspective, I kind of ended up with asset centric, edge centric, which I think you've touched on as well. Kind of like the litmuses and maybe the Hive MQs and folks like that. And then I did have a category which was kind of application centric, which was kind of a catch-all for those that maybe are not asset, but they are, maybe MES fits in that space where they are adding AI to kind of a legacy scope, right? And then I had IT enterprise, which was really more kind of for the those IT centric platforms like the ERP, right? And maybe to some extent the hyperscalers.
I mean, even to be fair, SAP's AI platforms are pretty horizontal, right? I mean,
Right.
they're pre-populated with a lot of their data models, but capability-wise, they're pretty robust.
They are, and with the alliance with Databricks, of course, that
Of course.
brings another factor. And I found I had to include Oracle, right? The original data company, I guess you could argue, right, or data behemoth, and they're still a player, right? Particularly in certain verticals, and they're doing some interesting things with OCI nowadays. But shouldn't forget them.
I think you mentioned edge too, and I think a dynamic that we're all talking, everyone's aware of now, is that even now the behemoths are rediscovering the edge. It was forgotten for years, right? Couldn't figure out the monetization model, but with both AWS and Microsoft certainly are now rediscovering the edge. Standards-based approaches to managing the edge, deploying AI workloads at the edge. So we're making some progress.
Yeah, a lot of discussion around control planes, which are largely about how do I manage the edge. Right? So yes, we're seeing
Uli Homan and the team at Microsoft did a document on that, kind of like what does the infrastructure look like on the factory of the future, and that was kind of a key element of that, is the kind of control plan.
Yeah. But let's talk about things that people can do right now. So more of those startups, or what do you see as maybe even opportunities where you don't want to mention a specific startup, but where you're seeing, because I think robotics may well be my next deep dive, right? I think I might be looking at that intersection of AI and
we don't call it robotics anymore. It's physical.
Right.
Right. That's
physical intelligence, right?
I mean, in reality, that's kind of, I mean, I think it's a better name, right? It's the intersection between physically doing something and mechatron. I always use mechatronics because it's kind of a superset of robotics. I mean, you can, and this is actually an interesting discussion too. Even though we have tools like AI, we don't have to do everything with AI, right?
Right.
Two very real examples I come across often. If something is a deterministic process, we can use traditional control methods and traditional workflow to manage those. We don't need to create agentic agents. And agentic AI can actually blend deterministic control and kind of AI and adaptive control. So once again, and not or, right? It's just
Yeah, I'm a fan of agents, but it's always I think we talked about it before.
Yeah.
The term agentic AI to me is, one, it's misleading, but two,
Sure.
I don't think all agents have to be AI, right? We have lots of ways of deploying agents, which might just be retrieving data or applying some heuristics or some traditional application logic or math principles, right?
Ken's Composable talks about it all the time, like
Yep.
what that agent might be orchestrating might be, yes, something that's AI and reinforcement learning based. It might also be, model predictive control algorithm over here,
Right.
kind of simple whatever, kind of all of the above. Same thing on data analytics, right? There's still a lot to be done with kind of the basic kind of statistical tools that we've had for quite some time. I think the difference here, maybe sometimes the eureka moments and the ability to optimize goes back to the data fabric. When the lens of input and context that you can look at to make decisions is broader, you're going to make better decisions, right?
Right.
I don't know if it was last time we talked about that issue in the paint booth defect issue at a auto plant that turned out to be when someone was cleaning in another part of the plant, solvents were getting into the air. So unless you had like this broad purview of all that data to look at, similarly, like, if we're just looking at a couple temperatures and pressures, there's only so much you can infer from that. The MES data, all the other kind of ambient environment data. So getting large amounts of data in appropriate context is kind of that's obviously the foundation. I think we discussed simulation too. I mean, that's becoming an increasingly important piece of the puzzle here.
Yeah, I think hybrid AI I tend to, I'm not sure I like any of the terms because I think agents also convey that in a indirect sense. To your point, each skill or each agent could be running a different type of AI or not even AI, right? But another example that you kind of triggered, because yes, I think having that the fact that you don't just have OT data or just not factory data, you have supply chain data, you have maintenance service data. The more holistic you can get on that, the more you can understand the end-to-end process and the causal effects, right?
Exactly.
So hence we get back to causal AI, and then I end up thinking of Georgia Pacific, who've done some interesting work. I think when I ran a workshop with Georgia Pacific and a number of our end customers. I think what struck me was they had taken factory performance data and linked it all the way through to procurement data
Right.
to show that actually the decisions that procurement people were making about the specifications of raw materials and kind of taking lower cost or lower quality, well, lower cost is obviously what procurement gets rewarded for, right? But they could actually show the ramifications of that on what they were actually producing and the cost of producing it, and starting to advise them on not taking the lowest cost, right?
You talked about doing your market sizing analysis, right? It's a natural tendency of those of us who came out of the plants to think of manufacturing enterprises as just the plants, and it's so much more, right?
So much more.
Design, procurement, service, but when you have that entire data set, right, that's where it gets. I know we've got a million terms for that too: digital thread, this, that, the other thing. But
yeah. I've kind of got a design-centric archetype in my IDF, which is more, the PLM life cycle kind of biased ones, right?
And Siemens is quietly accumulating a lot of interesting assets for that whole, design through deploy of facilities, products, things like that.
Right.
I'm certainly keeping my eye on.
Yeah, I'm certainly keeping an eye on them. And then you mentioned earlier the kind of, eventually we'll see industrial foundation models. And they have talked and actually used that term, right? And some of the acquisitions make that kind of perhaps more executable. But it's very much, I think, centered around that, the fact it's with the Altair acquisition, and it's very much that design to manufacturing approach, right? And so I'm not sure it will be, I don't think anyone can yet claim that they're going to deliver a broad industrial foundation model that would address all industries and all processes. But it's an interesting, it'll be interesting to see how many more of these it's not many that can make that level of investment, right?
Well, let me clarify that too. What I meant by that is I was kind of using that in the LLM context, right? So when you use GPT-4, GPT-5, or Llama 3, or the knowledge base that was trained on is like there's so much junk in there that's completely irrelevant to a manufacturing enterprise. The quickest flight options from here to here, or how to make a martini and how to translate Swahili into Hebrew, right? And these are all interesting things, but they make for bulky models that can be deployed cloud only, that are difficult to train. So what I meant by foundational models, yes, there's the machine learning kind of thing, like how a pump behaves and when it's going to fail. Sure, that's more traditional machine learning stuff. But then the knowledge side of it, right, which is all the encapsulating more than just that. It's somewhat linguistic, so that's what I'm wondering if we're going to start to see, or maybe someone already is doing that training.
Well, and that is what Siemens claims to be doing, but when they position it, it's very much around physical intel. So it's kind of the NVIDIA Siemens alliance, and a lot of that leans heavily towards understanding products and processes in a physical, the dimensions of that, and it's kind of almost an extension of OpenUSD into the industrial sector, right? But I mean, I think that is a big undertaking, right? But that would give you a lot more specific language, right, for a certain set of domain problems. And we could talk forever on this, but I want to get back to, now we're talking about the behemoths again, right? I'd like to get back to, why you shouldn't necessarily be waiting for those magical things to happen, which could be years away, right? What are the things you can get value from right now? In a lot of cases, I think that does come to where this intersection of the domain expertise, a lot of it coming from people who've been around in the industry for a long time, but have realized the value of the new capabilities in terms of cloud, AI, scale, lower cost of deployment.
I
And
see
we
it.
talked about quite a few of those, but I'm sure we haven't exhausted that, Rick.
I actually see it from both ends because I think what we're getting the benefit of is a new generation of folks coming into our industry because of their digital literacy and comfort with these kinds of technologies. They're coming up to speed pretty quickly on the manufacturing
It's a good
aspect.
point.
They've
Yeah.
been in the plant for a couple of years, but they're, doing some pretty amazing stuff. I always worked under the assumption, even when I was, creating software companies myself, that it's always a temporal opportunity, right? The DIY will get easier over time. It always does, right? Any new technology becomes more democratized, and you want to be part of that. You want to be part of making these technologies more widely adopted, faster to deploy, faster to scale across all your sites, across multiple applications. That's kind of foundational in the way I view it, and it's also kind of foundational in the companies that I look at. Like, do they help enable that? Because that's where you're going to have a successful business. Customers. There's so many cautionary tales about customers trying to DIY it. Plus, you're competing for talent with, look at what the behemoths are paying AI talent.
Oh, yeah, that's scary. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, be thoughtful about DIYing it too. The platforms have evolved to the point where it's a safer bet, right? You're going to get time to benefit from you faster.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, Rick, and I didn't mean to contradict you. I just wanted us to focus on innovators and startups, right? It was more, because we can talk about those big guys, and they'll get plenty of airtime. I take your points on. In fact, it is still an ecosystem, and I think we're seeing the ecosystems get reshaped around. And it's been happening for a while around the cloud players, but now we've got this injection of AI, which is maybe through the hyperscalers, but I think it's introduced another dimension, and we're not quite sure where that ends up with, the things like Siemens and Nvidia and maybe being able to make a level of investment, but probably still working with AWS or Microsoft to get the scale, right?
I'll have to write down the list here, but generically, I would say that most of the companies I work with, trying to think on the fly here, I would bet only a fraction of the models they use are pre-built models provided by cloud providers. The
Yeah,
vast
yeah.
majority are intellectual property that they've built, right? So that domain-specific innovation is every time the big guys try to go into that, it's always a change. We know we've seen it a million times. The more vertical they try and get, it's just hard for them. So a couple things is I think the other trend is moving to more solutions as opposed to just more. Oh, here's another. You have your SCADA, you have your this, you have your that, you have your data. Here's another tool you got to bring in and add to the 10 zillion tools you already have. I think they're becoming more comprehensive, right? So that connectivity, data transfer, all that stuff. Maybe it's fewer pieces and parts. And as we know, we talked about this in the first two sections. Legacy and brownfield is just a massive influence on what we do versus what the broader AI community can do, right? It can be a little bit more agile. So you have to be able to deal with the boring foundational stuff as well. But things like, I'll use Twinter as an example here, is some of the apps that they built around, hey, I want to optimize the moisture of this product. And then it'll basically provide real-time guidance to exactly what you need to do that. Or in biotech, you want a perfect batch that follows the exact profile. And it can either take control and make those or advise the operator. Energy optimization. They've got customers running, algorithms that are basically doing some of the closed loop and eureka moment energy stuff. But it's solving a specific problem, not
Right.
hey, let's throw a bunch of data in a data lake and then throw a bunch of data scientists at it and see what we come up with, right? It's a little more like an economic buyer can look at it and say, oh, Yes, I know what half a point or a full point of improved yield would be worth to me. Uh,
Yep.
so that shift is happening too, which is usual what happens in any new technology, right?
So, what's your advice to a startup in
Okay.
terms of things like aligning with Azure or AWS or GCP, and how you frame that? Is it a multi-cloud approach, or pick your poison? So, a couple of things like that, maybe, which are just, hey,
Yeah.
when I'm talking to a new startup trying to get into this is what the ecosystem looks like, and this is how I tell them to get started. So that might be useful.
It is, and I think it's a common discussion, right? Even as you know, I talk to a lot of startups that I don't invest in or advise, but coach and things like that. It's definitely a common discussion point. One is setting realistic expectations of how much mind share you're going to get from the big cloud providers or a big OEM partner or strategic investor. You have to earn that, and you have to have. Second thing is, it all comes down to the salespeople. Marketing people can help. It's okay to do those partnerships if you just want visibility. Nothing wrong with that at all. Show up in a booth, maybe some joint webinars. That's hugely valuable. But if you really want to monetize it, that's a lot of work. And you have to, sounds like a really stupid and trivial detail, but I've learned this to be almost unequivocally true. You need to be able to deploy in the customer's tenant, which means, we all want to build SaaS. You just go and buy. Well, this changes the way. So you need to prepare not only for deploying and managing in the cloud, but deploying in multiple customer subscriptions and tenants. I will say, as a result of that, a lot of companies have built the DevOps knowledge and experience that also help them become multi-cloud. So most of them are, in fact, multi-cloud. And you're going to inevitably have a few customers in the industrial domain that say, I absolutely have to have it behind the firewall, whether it's their data centers or out at the edge. So the shift to kind of a Kubernetes or containerized approach,
Right.
that's just good hygiene, right? And I think it does help you if you want to be multi-cloud. But that's the technical stuff, and it helps with scale and all that. From a kind of commercial and awareness, you just have to understand what you want to get out of those relationships. Similarly, a lot of these companies are being pinged early on for strategic investors, like a large automation company or someone wants to invest in them. You need to be very, very thoughtful in that, because you're giving them kind of a front row seat to the good, the bad, and the ugly. You really want to do that at this point? And then again, what do you want to get out of that relationship? Is it go to market? Classic challenge that all these companies face is, you're based in the US, you're based in Germany, you're based in Singapore. How do you get that reach, right? And sometimes these companies can help. Sometimes more often than not, you have to do it yourself. So it's and then scale, right? How do you, if people, that's the other challenge, right? That all these companies, you have to hire ahead of the curve. If you find the best people in our domain, get them right while they're available, because they're a precious commodity. There's a lot of startups right now in our world battling for an increasingly small pool of people that really get it. So that's a big challenge as well. Hiring the right people and hiring them, soon.
Right. And I think maybe you've kind of touched on a lot of really great advice there, but what about the AI, being AI agnostic, right? Not tying yourself too much to any one tool or model. How do you respond to that kind of
Again,
question?
that's good. That's good hygiene to be. Things change. Look how rapidly foundation models have changed, right? I think
Right.
that me as my architect role, that's just the way I would do things. Excuse me, abstracting away the data store, abstracting away any algorithm, engine, piece of the puzzle. So to me, that's just kind of the natural way I would develop software. Unless the exception would be if you're teeing yourself up for acquisition by company X, then maybe you kind of go all in on check all their boxes, and that's it's okay. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So yeah, and the cost, this is the other side of it. The cost structures of these things are very indeterminate and very variable. So that flexibility, like as a startup now, it's increasingly difficult to price your offering.
Right.
The compute intensity of doing essentially the same thing at two different customers might be very different. Ironically, that's the other tangential benefit of deploying in the customer's subscription. Let them be responsible for the infrastructural cost. You provide the value-added software. It doesn't help with the question of budget planning. Customers need to budget, but that's typically not been a big obstacle. It's just something to think about. Like if you're trying to price a true SaaS offering,
It's very much a factor. Yeah.
right? What's your
Yeah.
LLM bill? What's your data ingest bill and data storage bill going to be? It's kind of hard to predict. These sound like mundane details, but if you ever want to be a
No,
problem,
no, I mean, that's why we're seeing so many kind of put these token limits on their SaaS offerings, right? And if you use more than that, then there's going to be add-on costs because that's the only way they can keep it under control, right? No, I think and I agree with you. I think it's a hygiene thing. It's almost a standard recommendation on any of my AI stuff is remain AI agnostic. Don't get sucked into any one model.
one big exception, unless it's your unique intellectual property, right? If the models are yours,
Yep, yep,
for sure. And then they may change over time as well. But yeah, there's
yeah,
definitely, I mean, to me, that shifts you on that valuation spectrum we talked about from, wrapper to application to unique, defensible intellectual infrastructure. So some companies will find themselves up on that end.
yeah. One of the things we've been hearing from our end user clients, right, is really everyone is coming at them with AI solutions, right? They're labeled as AI solutions. They don't have the skills or the people with the skills to actually validate the claims.
Yeah.
And then as they start looking at it, increasingly it's I've got to move data out of my tenant or make it accessible to that vendor.
Hmm.
I don't know what they're doing with the data. Are they training their own systems on the data? Who owns the IP
My
from
recipe,
that?
yeah, my secret recipe just left the facility.
Right. You take that's one concrete example, but it's kind of across the board, right? It's kind of like, okay, and what happens when I have hundreds of agents, right, all using different models, and now I've got to somehow I've just created a cybersecurity and IP nightmare, right?
Well, two thoughts on that. One is, first, I challenge every company that puts AI in its messaging or its name, take AI out immediately. Take it out, and does your message, and then refine your message without using that term ever.
Right. Right.
It needs to be understandable right by regular people. Don't whitewash AI wash and all these technical terms. That's number one. Second thing is you brought up an interesting and very important point about customer capacity. It's another thing I'm finding more frequently than not is customers have plenty of money to embark on industrial, data and industrial AI. That's money isn't the problem. They often tend to be resource constrained, and it's
Right.
not resources that an SI or the vendor can provide. So the other piece of advice is if companies want to start capturing the opportunity, it's very real opportunity right now to get significant percentage improvements. You're going to have to beef up your internal teams to support these. You can't say, well, we'll get to it 2 years later. Well, you've lost 2 years of opportunity, and your competitors might not have. So
Yeah.
it is time for people to invest in resources to support these projects and programs.
As always, Rick, it's been fun. And we've probably generated another 3 or 4 episodes on if we wanted to pull some of the threads we talked about today. But I think you gave some great examples. Call out to all the startups you mentioned. They're all doing.
There's plenty. Lots of good companies out there.
Lots of good companies out there. They're doing great work, and I think your point about that's where the real domain knowledge, where you will find people that can cross the industrial and AI domains and make it deliver real outcomes or valuable outcomes. So I think that's the underlying takeaway here. And you gave some really great advice on what to do if you're looking at creating your own startup or you're looking at engaging with startups and to the startups themselves. So thanks a lot for that. Rick, I'm sure we'll have a part 4 and maybe a part 5. But for now, let's wrap up the industrial systems engineering in the era of AI part 3. And look forward to talking to you again soon, Rick.
Cheers.